Hello, welcome this afternoon to my video today on Chanequa Walker Barnes and her book, I Bring the Voices of My People, a Womanist Vision for Racial Reconciliation. And this book was published in 2019 by Erdman's publishing house. And so here's the structure of the book. Chapter 1, racism is not about feelings or friendship. Chapter 2, racism is not a standalone issue. Chapter 3, the unbearable whiteness of being. Chapter 4, reconciliation begins with a curse. And Chapter 5, our spiritual strivings. And I'm grateful to have this book in my hand and to be talking about it with you. I also feel in some way ill-prepared, but also challenged, and I welcome you to the challenge as well. Just a bit of bio could be helpful here as well on my end. I grew up interculturally as a third culture kid in a missionary context, but also experienced from 5th grade on a very racially segregated town, Anderson, Indiana. And I think it's the same place that Dr. Streety Wimberly is from. So we experienced, I really experienced kind of a racial formation as a white person. And this book, Chanequa Walker Barnes' book, is really helpful in understanding this. So this book is really a book for the moment, and I strongly encourage you to read it. There's a sense in which it's exactly the right kinds of conversation to have. And the challenges that it presents are challenges for our time and at the heart of pastoral care. So in the preface, she talks about growing up in Atlanta under the shadow of the Atlanta child murderers and going from a black and white school, a black to a white school, white-controlled middle school. And that's when she really started to experience more overt racism, being profiled. She talks about homes being shared with civil rights leaders and having trouble finding the good in predominantly white institutions. So this was, there was these moments of enculturation for her as well. She experienced formative experiences at Duke where voices of women were missing from the racial reconciliation conversation, especially in Southern working class voices, what Anna Julia Cooper called the horny-handled toiling men and women. So their testimony was absent in the racial reconciliation conversation, which she wants to address. So Dr. Walker Barnes really brings together in this conversation racial reconciliation, gender, and evangelical conversation with evangelical theology as well, are some of her conversation partners. For her, in the introduction, she says that racial reconciliation, that movement, really started in these spaces of evangelicalism, where they hope to, in an idealistic sense, obliterate barriers between African American and white men. So she says that men were really the primary conversation partners, and in that sense, they ignored intersectionality. There was an important conversation, U.S. racial crisis and world evangelism, where there was a discussion of, this was by Tom Skinner at InterVarsity Press. There was a discussion of the ongoing scandal of racism as a scandal that would impact world mission. And she talks about, there's a big discussion of Promise Keepers in this introduction and how Promise Keepers had included race in its original charter, and how blacks and Latinx participants spoke back to the conversation about racial reconciliation unless it included some discussion of how affirmative action was being discussed, how welfare reform was being discussed. For them, they weren't comfortable just having race as and racial reconciliation as a construct without addressing some of the impacts of structural racism. So in this evangelical framing, if separateness in worship is the problem, then reconciliation is then the solution, and almost a too easy solution for Walker Barnes. She quotes Jen Harvey, who says, "Our separation shows that we don't understand our shared identity." And in this movement of racial reconciliation, there's two foci. One is transforming interpersonal relationships, and the other is establishing racially diverse congregations. But in the Promise Keeper worldview, of course, women are largely wives and daughters, and women of color aren't really even seen in this framework, she argues. Indeed, Dr. Walker Barnes says that in order for us to understand racial reconciliation, women's experience needs to be in the foreground. And racial reconciliation is part of God's broader eschatological work, in which we have to decenter white supremacy that distorts all of us. She quotes Stephanie Mitchum's foundational work on womanism. What we do to black women's bodies shows us about the powers and principalities in our culture, she says. So she's going to address this in terms of colorism, mammification, and the hypersexualization of women of color, specifically African American women. So for her, intersectionality is a complex reality that's kind of exponential. So instead of it just being focusing on race or gender, she says her racial and gender identity is in terms of oppression, it multiplies itself. So the oppression that she faces is different from just looking at one strand at a time. If you were going to say, hey, I'm just going to look at what it means to be a woman, or I'm going to look at what it means to be an African American, she says, no, looking at those together leads to a multiplication of oppression, especially how women, African American women, are expected to bend and genuflect to just occupy smaller and smaller spaces. One of the ways that happens is weaving the mask of the strong black woman. This refers back to her work in Too Heavy a Yoke. So that African American women are constructed as strong so that to hide how they really feel, so people won't be able to see when they need help. And this diminishes their own ability to see the image of God in themselves, she says on page 14. Simple intercultural contact approaches then won't save us. For Chanequa Walker Barnes, something much deeper is required. So that's the introduction. She says in the first chapter, racism is not about feelings or friendship. Okay? So this is chapter 1. Everybody buckle in a sense. If you feel this way, that's just fine. She's going to address us directly and address our challenges directly in this moment. So in this particular climate, racism is not about feelings or friendship. We still have sundown towns around our communities where people of color are not welcome. The Obama era kind of exploded that post-racial myth, she says. And she goes into talking about how there's a common idea that race isn't really real. So race is a social construction, and racism is a sin based on the division of a social construction that isn't really real. So if you look at us, 99% of us share all genetic material together. It's only a small fraction of us that have any difference between one another. And you can't guess who's going to share more genetic material based on race. So race is a total illusion, right? So then the idea would be simply that addressing racism requires just increasing contact. In the classical racialism, there was a belief that race was ontological, and eugenics and Hitler worked to exterminate races based on the idea that people were different. There's modern day racism in research like in work like the Bell Curve, which argues that was a kind of a racist social science book that talked about genetics being the basis of intellectual differences. But there's no distinct genetic or otherwise biological markers of racial difference. So she goes on to say there's this constructivist worldview that says there's really nothing in the world that corresponds to the concept race, so we should just get rid of race as a construct. And in the socially constructed view, there's no causally, biologically determinative underpinnings of race, so it doesn't really exist. In fact, racism's invention coincides with that expansion of colonialism in the 15th and 16th century, where there was a sense in which if we could divide people into racial categories and showed some to be more or less human than others, you would have then tools to oppress and exploit and alienate. And she goes on to talk about some of the discussions of certain diseases that people are susceptible to. That Africans were protected from malaria but susceptible to sickle cell, and Europeans were prone to cystic fibrosis. And she talks about phenotypical and cultural differences. And she talks as well about the census as a place where racial categories are not biologically based but reinforced, and kind of essentialist in our culture as well. One of the interesting things that Dr. Chanequa Walker-Barnes says is that social constructionist arguments that say race is not real are generally unhelpful in ameliorating the modern conditions of modern racism, which often relies upon a colorblind kind of racism. It's a abstract liberalism that says there's no need for race, there's just merit. And this abstract liberalism pretends to be colorblind while it naturalizes certain differences. And then it also blames people of color, using historical victimization as a grounds for that, and then minimizes racism as existing in just a few bad apples. So she talks about the Moynihan Report as an example of the minimization of racism and cultural racism. So she says that in modern forms of symmetrical treatment enshrined in the law, everyone should just be seen as equal. But in fact, what happens is that racism is an interlocking system that promotes white supremacy even as it denies itself. So we could deny that race is a real category, biologically based, but it could still be at work in power. And if we deny its power, then people could just kind of say, well, I'm colorblind, and they could use a variety of these colorblind strategies to say, we're really not culpable for racism, or racism isn't here, it's somewhere else. And she talks about the experience of middle-class, educated African Americans who can't afford a down payment because they haven't been able to accumulate generational wealth. And she talks about how constructionism really is not the right place to start for her. So she's going to take us down a different road. Chapter 2 then. Racism is not a standalone issue. For Dr. Walker-Barnes, racism is not a standalone issue. The Civil Rights Act decontextualized race as an issue for her, but racism then became separated from race or religious identity. And all of this has to do, in her sense, with racial reconciliation movements' failure to interrogate patriarchy. She turns to Cherie Moraga, who asks, how have I internalized my oppression? And she tells some powerful stories, including a story about how she tried to diversify the character of her son's childhood chapter books, or thick baby books, infant books. But even after all those characters were persons of color, her son still said that he wanted to be white. He said God doesn't like brown skin, God likes white skin. And she talks about how so there's a way in which our images of God are reflective even of our racial categories, our racial understandings that then become internalized and passed on in our religious spaces. She's going to turn now to talk about the distinctive nature of the oppression that women of color face. And she's going to do that in several steps. First of all, she says women of color is not a helpful umbrella term, but it's one that we've been given. And then inside that, you can kind of tease out some of the differences and important differences as well. She talks about mammification and hypersexualization and then differences in skin tone. So she goes into some detail describing how skin tone is more important than almost anything else in conferring racial status. She talks about Jill Nelson's discussion about body and color and how she's judged by color. And then she goes to examples globally, including surgeries to change eye patterns in India and Japan, and then whitening cream in Nigeria. In fact, whitening cream is so common in the African continent that in the Ivory Coast they had to develop a whole new beauty pageant just for people with unbleached skin. So skin then becomes a caste marker, and even she talks about for Latinos, it's a one drop on the way to whiteness for Latinos. Some Latin American countries have kind of hastened the process of immigration. So being light-skinned, she argues, because of racism, has been a form of racial capital that leads to social networks, jobs, concrete, really benefits. And in the criminal justice system, it's rare to find a dark skin. In the criminal justice system, being dark-skinned is more likely to lead to stiffer prison sentences. And it's rare to find a dark-skinned African-American who's a leading figure or a love interest in a movie. Values based on women's beauty and patriarchy then become one of the chief ways in which women's oppression is experienced for African-American women and for women of color as a whole. So black women really feel unseen and invisible. And as a result, one of the consequences of this is that they spend about $7.5 billion a year on beauty products, 80% more than the general market. Dr. Walker Barnes is making a point here. She's not being reductionistic, but she's making a point. And Latinx women who are perceived as dark are then also faced with a kind of ridicule. So there's a backlash and parts of passing in this experience of light-skinned women. And then she talks a little bit about mammification, which for her is this process of depicting women of color as servants, someone who exists totally for whites. And she says that the mammy became a staple of Reconstruction narratives but there's no basis for this stereotype in reality. But in the Reconstruction period, there was a wanting to just depict racial relations as one of interracial harmony and loyalty. And so the figure of the weeping mammy in the statue in Arlington, Virginia, is an example of this. So mammy is used as a title then, and some whites describe not even knowing that these women had names. So plaques and monuments to faithful slaves crop up all over the South, where mammies and mammy figures are featured. And she shares this. This continues to have current ramifications. She shares as a woman of color had a colleague tell her that she should be more like her mammy growing up. So again, she was being racialized in the workplace in ways that depicted her as a stereotype, a trope, a servant, less than a human being, less than the full colleague that she was. And some of the consequences of this, Marion Nismo is one way to see this showing up among Latinx women who are depicted as being subservient or willing to serve, and that is then taking on Mary as kind of a place of suffering and a place where they have to identify with that suffering and imitate it. So the consequences of this, and this builds again on Dr. Walker Barnes' previous work, a consequence of this is that women of color are expected to take on more and more difficult work without complaining. So they're made to work extra hard. She quotes a book called Presumed Incompetent, where it says, if you're a woman of color, you're expected to be nurturing. And so black women, in their teaching evaluations, as professors, consistently get low marks on the my professor cares about me section. in that part of the teaching evaluations. And she says this is part of that mammy legacy. So there's tons of other kind of metaphors or stereotypes used for women of color. The Jezebel, the spicy Latina, the dragon lady, and the squaw. These are the negative side of the submissive images. Interestingly, she notes that the Bible doesn't mention Jezebel's sexuality. That doesn't seem to be a part of the conversation. And she talks about the accusations of rape against minorities, especially in this historical experience of black men's lynching. She says, "I am not your mammy," is the internal cry of black women in work and ministry settings where women of color are expected to carry a heavier load. And end quote on page 111 there, 111. So in order to stand with women, we have to address these double binds that they face. For Dr. Walker Barnes, she says it's not enough just to address the racial reconciliation movement through categories of male power, some men communicating to other men about power, but she says that it's important that we dismantle structural racism to look at the impact that it has on people's lives, especially women of color, and start with that starting place of oppression in mind. So I think, just to rephrase what I've said so far in this video, Dr. Walker Barnes begins this book with a clear chapter, chapter 2, where she talks about how racism is not a standalone issue. And in this chapter, she's talking particularly about the impacts of racism on women of color. And she doesn't reinforce these stereotypes of the hypersexualized African-American female or the mammy figure, but she wants to talk about their impacts and the ongoing nature of those stereotypes and how they impact the ability of women of color to show up and be complete participants in their workplace. So in the next video that I'm going to share, I'm going to talk about those next 3 chapters of her book, The Unbearable Whiteness of Being, Reconciliation Begins with a Curse, and Our Spiritual Strivings. In order to do them justice, I want to talk about her constructive proposals and her solutions in the second video. Thank you for watching, and this book has been incredibly powerful and challenging for me. It's opened my eyes and called me to a new sense of responsibility, but by no means have I done it justice or said it right even in this sense. But I'm grateful for this important book and for the contribution that this book is going to be to my teaching and to the field of pastoral care as it gets more and more attention in the next couple of years. So that's the first part of my video. Thank you very much.